Reflections with Marilyn Baker. Brought to you by Torch Trust, the Christian organisation with a vision for people with sight loss.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Reflections from Torch Trust, the show that focuses on faith and disability in today's world. I'm Marilyn Baker, and it's wonderful to have your company. This week on Reflections is the first of a two-part inspiring special chat with Penny Melville-Brown, a former Royal Navy commander who lost her sight during her time serving in the Navy. But after losing her sight, she didn't give up on life. She turned her hand to helping those with disabilities get back into work. She worked for the government and even ended up going round the globe talking about her other passion, baking. She's chatting with Torch Trust's Sheila Armstrong this week about her life in the Royal Navy and sight loss.
Penny Melville-Brown, thank you for joining us on Reflections from Torch Trust. So why don't we start at the beginning of the time when you decided to join the Navy?
I was still at university in my postgraduate year. I was doing a teaching qualification, but I was pretty confident I didn't want to teach up at Goldsmith College, which was a super place. And I was doing all sorts of exciting things. And I was engaged at the time. And I'd been engaged, since I was about 15, 16.
Oh, that was young.
We were actually starting to plan the wedding the following year. And his name was Simon, and he was killed in a road traffic accident.
Oh, no.
It was quite grim. And I think that is an understatement.
Yeah.
But I decided that I needed to do something completely different with life. And I was finding it very difficult to go back to my hometown of Brighton, because he and I had been quite well known around Brighton for many years, and everything was a reminder of him. So I applied for any job I could lay my hands on. And so it was insurance, banking, publishing, advertising, retail. And then there was this advert in the newspaper for the Navy. So I signed up for that too. I didn't actually realize they were trying to recruit men, but somehow my application, my little note got through. And one thing led to another, and a couple of interviews, and then an Admiralty interview board at HMS Sultan down here in Hampshire. And I was accepted for the Navy as a direct entry, i.e. somebody in those days who was a graduate. And so I was going to spend a few months learning about the Navy, and then I was going to go off to Dartmouth to become an officer. And in those days, it was the Women's Royal Naval Service, the WRENS.
Yeah.
So that's how it happened.
Yes, and in your career in the Royal Navy, you kept progressing. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I had an absolutely fabulous career. I did Dartmouth, and we did a couple of courses, one up at Chatham and one down here in Portsmouth, just a month each. And then they said, would you like to go to Naples, Italy? Well, you can imagine I wasn't actually holding back on that.
No.
I had to get all weighed up in tropical uniform. And I went out to Naples, and there was a naval base, naval headquarters on an island just off Naples. But we lived on the main armed forces base, which was all NATO, in the main part of Naples. And I was doing NATO intelligence and having a wonderful time. And I became the Vice Commodore of the NATO Naval Yacht Club.
Well, that sounds very impressive.
Well, it sounds all of that, but it was only because I could throw good parties.
Oh, I see.
And I was out there for 3 years and had a really super time. I became quite expert in odd bits of stuff and went over to America to speak, and often up to Brussels to speak. I went to Gibraltar and Athens and various other places around the Mediterranean, because that was our main area of operations, with NATO navies in the south of NATO.
Yeah, so you actually became a commander, is that right?
That was some time later. In those days, I was a probationary third officer, lowest below.
So there was a bit to climb up the ladder.
Equivalent in those days to a sub-lieutenant. And I did more jobs in home defence and war planning, doing corporate public relations in the Ministry of Defence. I ran the University Royal Naval Units, which is the equivalent of the Army's OTCs. And then I was invited, I was at lunch with somebody, and they said, what we really need is a woman barrister. And I said, oh, well, I could do that. So,
all right. Did you have a law degree?
No. So I went off and did a year of academic law, then a year at bar school. Then I did pupillage, and all the time I was in the Navy. And then my first job as a naval barrister was at HMS Nelson in Portsmouth, which was the equivalent of the biggest magistrates' court in the Royal Navy, because we would have lots of people, alleged miscreants, who would come to us from all over the world, from ships all over the world, and where we would hold their little trials. And most of them were quite small. And my job was to advise both the defence and the prosecution about what they had to prove or what they could use as a defence, and then to advise the Commodore about his sentencing powers. And that all went very well, and we were really busy. And I was also prosecuting and defending at courts martial for more serious offences. And by that time, my eyesight was starting to have some problems.
Was it? Yes.
And they decided that I probably had a condition called uveitis, which is some sort of inflammation. And they were trying to treat it. It wasn't really working very well, and I was starting to use some magnified print by then. But then I went down to become the staff legal advisor to Flag Officer Plymouth down at the headquarters at Mount Wise. And my eyesight was continuing to deteriorate. And eventually I was referred up to Moorfields. And that was the start of being off sick for 14 months, because they were trying to save my right eye with huge doses of steroids. And it was just like being puffed up like a balloon. So I was very unwell for a very long time. Couldn't really walk, could hardly breathe at some stages, a couple of emergency admissions to hospital. But then they said, well, it's your right eye or you die. So there's not much choice there, is it?
No.
So I gave up my right eye, went back in uniform to the Navy and got another job and did very well and was promoted to commander there. And then I did 2 more jobs as a commander. By that time, I was using a white cane. My left eye had failed. I could manage with screen magnification, and I think I was using 36 bold on my printed documents.
Goodness, that is very big.
It is. I had a special binder because the documents were so enormous, you couldn't get a staple through them.
No, you'd only get 2 or 3 words to a page, really, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Yes.
And then I was medically discharged from the Navy. So that's a very long answer.
That's absolutely amazing. So actually, you were a commander when you were a blind person.
Yes.
Do you think you're the only one?
I don't know. I suspect that there were other disabled people in the military at the time, which is actually quite exceptional, because the military is not covered by the Equality Act in terms of employing disabled people. But they are incredibly supportive. And for me to be able to continue working as I went through this pretty dire transition and some very, very poor health, gave me the confidence to know I can still do anything, even though I can't see.
Yeah, that was good, because a lot of people really do cave in, and some of the people listening to us now will really be able to relate to that. It made you persevere.
I'm less convinced than you are that people cave in. I think it's much more that life caves in around them.
Well, yes, that's a good
I
way to
think
put it.
most people want to carry on being fulfilled in life. And that doesn't
Yes.
mean you've got to go and earn money, but it means that you want to have a reason for living, a meaning to your life. And for me, that is absolutely fundamental. And when we get lots of outside agencies, and it can be health, benefits, job, employers, friends, family, when they're all telling you or suggesting to you that you're not able to do anything anymore, it's very easy to believe them because there's a lot of people saying the same thing.
Yeah, I can see that.
And to be able to prove to yourself, that's me thumping my chest.
Yeah, thump away, sister.
that you can still be a worthwhile person, for me, is the most important thing in the world.
Well, I agree with you. I've been blind from birth, and I have taken that line myself.
Yes.
And it's good to encourage people that they can. And it's always good to hear about people who have managed to stand up in it all, because it must have been really difficult for you, incredibly different from being a person who could see properly to, well, somebody who's totally blind now.
Yes. And when I say to be worthwhile, it doesn't mean you've got to go off and earn money.
No.
But that's nice. And that's part of your independence.
Yeah.
But it's being worthwhile to your family and friends, but also to your community. And your community can be just close to where you live, but also it can be nationally or, regionally or, county-wise. And I've done all of those things since then, because I hope that I have something to offer.
Yeah.
I want to be able to share that and do my best. And it's not about me, although I get the side benefits. It's about doing my best to make a contribution to other people. And helping is one way of putting that. But it sounds as if I'm being rather gracious lady of the manor, dashing out.
Not at all.
You know what I mean?
Yeah,
and that's not what I mean at all.
So I'm going to ask you in a minute about what things you have actually done, but I understand that in 2017 you fell into a coma for 5 weeks. That must have been really scary for your loved ones and those around you.
I didn't actually fall into a coma. This was, not quite 20 years after I'd left the Navy.
Mm.
And I was in a road traffic accident in France.
Oh, goodness.
And it was quite difficult because there was this big bang and I didn't really know what had happened.
No.
There was a very bright light on my right-hand side. Not that I can see a bright light. The temptation was to progress towards that light. Now, you've heard of all these things and it all sounds a bit apocryphal, but I thought, this could be me being tempted to give up and die. And I thought, I'm not having any of that. So I sat in this car and shouted and just shouted and shouted. I all sorts of things. It didn't matter. It was me saying to me, I am still alive. I am not giving in. And the next thing I heard were the sapeurs-pompiers, which are the French fire brigade, and they were starting to cut the roof off the car to get me out. And that's all I know I think I was in a coma for 6 weeks.
Yeah.
And then I was in intensive care in France for 2 months because I had broken my C2 vertebra, which is one of those ones right at the top of your neck. And the risk was that I was, 1, going to die, or 2, if I did survive, I would be paralyzed from the neck down. All 3, I could get better. And I got better.
You got better.
3 months in a rehabilitation hospital in France, to learn to walk again, to stand again. It was that critical.
Gosh. Well, Penny, it's quite clear that you really do not let anything hold you back. And you've created a company called Disability Dynamics. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Right. Well, this is rewind time then. So this goes back
this was before the coma.
This was well before the coma.
Right.
So back in 1999, I left the Navy, but I've been networking madly to try and find some paid work because in those days I didn't know much about anything. And I thought I wasn't going to be able to work. I had no income. I wouldn't be able to pay my mortgage and I would lose my home. And that was pretty critical stuff for me.
Yeah.
So I decided I would become, wait for it, a disability consultant.
Yeah.
On the basis of not much at all.
Well, you did have lived experience, so that was a basis.
I did have lived experience, and I was a lawyer, so I was a great blagger.
Yeah, that's true. No comment.
I did work very hard to understand the law, understand what was going on. I took off uniform on the Friday. On the Tuesday, I was in my first paid work, which was a project helping disabled people to get back to work. And that has always been my driving ambition throughout my career since leaving the Navy, because I had such problems and I didn't want other people to be in the same place.
We were listening to the inspiring story of Penny Melville-Brown, who worked her way up to the post of commander in the Royal Navy, all while dealing with deterioration of her sight. We'll hear the next part of Penny's story next week here on Reflections, which includes turning her hand to helping others getting back into work, and how her passion for baking took her around the world. It's time now for this week's thought, and with the Euro 2024 football tournament taking place, this is quite appropriate. It's titled Football, Fouls and King David, written by Stephen Richards and read for us by James Brookman.
What happens when a football player places a well-aimed kick on another player's shin? They might get shown a card or be sent off, even given a match suspension. But doubtless he'll be back playing again within a week or two. Now imagine someone taking a kick at the king's shin, and the outrage would be of a different order altogether. Why should this be? After all, the act was identical. Someone kicked someone's shin. The answer is, of course, that the offence lies not so much in the act itself, but against whom the offence was committed. Now, keeping in mind that all wrongdoing offends a righteous and good God, read on. King David, about 1000 BC, ruled Israel in what was called the nation's golden age. His prestige, power and success caused him to be lax towards God. The devil finds work for idle hands, and, while his troops were at war, David lusted after the beautiful Bathsheba. He had his way with her, and she became pregnant. In an attempt to conceal what he'd done, he manipulated things so that Bathsheba's husband was killed in battle, so freeing her to marry the king. God appears to have been well off David's radar screen at this time. God graciously sent David a prophet named Nathan to touch his heart and to appeal to his sense of right and wrong. Once David had his view of God back in focus, he was conscience-stricken, cut to the heart, as we say. He called out to God in earnest. "Against you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight." Although David says, "Against you only have I sinned," I don't believe he was oblivious to the fact that he had done wrong to both Bathsheba and her husband. Nevertheless, a bit like the disparity between the football player and the king, he realised that his offences were first and foremost against God himself. David knew that when he was in trouble, even in trouble with God, the answer was not to run away, but to come towards God, who alone could bring him relief and forgiveness. As Nathan the prophet was sent to David, God has sent us Jesus. It is he who shows us in sharp focus who God is. This so that our consciences might be awakened and we be drawn towards him. Here, forgiveness awaits those who earnestly want it. God will not refuse a contrite heart. see Psalm 51.
Thank you to James Brookman for reading this week's thought on the theme of football and King David. I hope you've been inspired by Penny Melville-Brown and her time in the Royal Navy. The next part of her story is next week. Don't forget that Torch Trust has its second Zoom coffee morning coming up, plus there's an introduction to becoming a sight-loss-friendly church on the 1st of July. Both very important and definitely dates for the diary. If you want to join in or just want to find out more about any of these events with Torch Trust, you can give us a call on 01858 438 260 or email info@torchtrust.org. Until next week, from me, Marilyn Baker, goodbye and God bless.
Reflections from Torch Trust.